What's up? It's another episode of the Rain Race podcast. It's the unofficial, I guess, 1 year anniversary of kicking back this podcast, rebooting it for like the fifth time, with this not so new anymore, but the guy off to my right, Stu, off in the Esses. It's been a year now. I think it's been like 24-ish episodes, if I'm not mistaken.
Sounds about right.
That we've been doing this show, talking about IMSA and the World Endurance Championship, and hopefully to many more.
Man, I can't believe that it's been a year already. It feels like it has flown by. It feels like just yesterday we were having our first episode, and I think we talked about did we talk about that three-letter word that
we
don't want to talk
started
about?
off with a real great, with a great one for sure. But you can go back in a year and check out that episode if you want. I was going to say, hopefully, a year under the table here, we're a lot more nuanced. We're a lot more experienced and knowledgeable of what we have to do. Lo and behold, we're starting a few minutes late, which is, some things never change, but that's that's quite all right, I suppose. This episode, we got a couple things to recap. Of course, we have the Lone Star Le Mans from Circuit of the Americas, the World Endurance Championship return to that circuit for the first time since 2020. We also have some pretty big GTP news over on the IMSA side that was confirmed this morning. It's like the third week in a row where having a Thursday episode is paying dividends for us instead of our typical Tuesday. Maybe we'll have to move that permanently. We'll see. But yeah, and then we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can throughout the episode. If you want to ask us anything, drop it in the chat, and we'll try to get to those as we go. So, I guess we'll start things off here. World Endurance Championship at COTA. I'm going to put both hands up right now. I'm going to clear myself of any wrongdoing in advance, because if you listen to last week's episode, you may recall I was not able to catch the majority of this race live. I was away from home. I was able to catch some of it on my phone. And despite the fact that it was a holiday weekend in the United States, I was not able to catch up on the entire 6-hour race on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. And now it's Thursday. But try to catch up on as many of the major talking points as I could. But I'm sure there's a couple things in there that I might have missed. And I apologize in advance if some of those go unmentioned. The first thing I want to talk about here, though, we did mention last week that, or I guess I mentioned my predictions last week. I thought that this was going to be a track that was pretty indicative of the pace that we had seen from different manufacturers at the 24 Hours of Le Mans this year. I think the track itself shares a lot of similarities with that circuit, despite the fact that it is significantly shorter, significantly warmer this year, and in a completely different part of the world. Long straightaways, high speed turns. You do have a couple of slower sort of 90-degree turns on that circuit as well, though. A couple, I guess we'll call them a couple hairpin turns. Really only one major hairpin turn. But I think that became pretty clear early on in the weekend with the pace that we were seeing in practice and qualifying, that it was sharing a lot of similarity with the pace that we had seen from some of the different teams and manufacturers at Le Mans. My pick going into the race was, of course, the number 2 Cadillac. I think that judging where they were at Le Mans and judging where they were pace-wise this weekend, it was a pretty decent shot going in, but I really think the manufacturer I should have looked on going by that basis was Ferrari. I mean, you look at them as a manufacturer that was extremely strong at Le Mans last year. They were very strong at Le Mans again this year, just on raw pace, but then also pace throughout the duration. And they were strong from the get-go this weekend at COTA as well. Was able to qualify in the top 2 positions, clearing out the top 2, or clearing out the front row on the grid with the number 51 Ferrari over the, we'll call it customer, number 83, of course, a yellow 499P, and then followed up in third place by that number 2 Cadillac. A couple other manufacturers that were surprising to me this weekend, at least in terms of pace. Alpine, saw some pace out of them at the 24 Hours of Le Mans before they had that disastrous end on the reliability front, but also BMW was a very big surprise at Le Mans this year in their qualifying pace. And lo and behold, they secured 7th and 8th in qualifying for COTA. So me personally, I don't know if you noticed the same trend, Stu, but at least in the hypercar class, I was seeing quite a few similarities between those two races in the WEC this year.
Yeah, I think you kind of nailed it there. There's maybe more similarities between COTA and Le Mans than we had initially thought of. That being said, we'll talk about it as this episode goes on and as we get into the race, but still some surprises, I thought, over the course of this weekend, and I'm very much in your boat as well. Didn't get to watch the entire race live. I got to watch sort of the beginning and the end, missed the middle chunk, but I think there was still some very telling tales in those portions of this race, but. Yeah, Ferrari being strong makes sense. BMW, you mentioned that they showed some solid pace at Le Mans, showed solid pace here as well, and the same with Alpine. The Mechachrome engine didn't let them down here. So we'll talk about more about the race in a second.
Yeah. Well, let's continue things on with the manufacturer I thought was going to be strong, Cadillac, because despite their pretty promising qualifying position in third place, didn't really stay that positive for too long. They had a very rough start in the first lap of that race. Eventually had some contact from the 35 Alpine in turn 12, which is, if you're not too aware of the COTA corner numbers, it's okay because I wasn't either. The end of that long straightaway before the left-hand turn is, I guess, the best way I can describe it. They ended up falling down to P8 after the first lap, but the damage, well, I guess, literally wasn't quite done there. They ended up picking up some dive plane damage to the nose of that car that they had to carry with them throughout the duration of the race, opting to not change that nose out so they could try to continue their fight within the top 5. But really, it's one of those teams that I think is struggling to catch a break this year. They were very strong at Spa, had that nasty crash with hour and 45 or so minutes left in the race. At Le Mans, had a lot of pace, ran into some reliability issues there. And now here at COTA, their home race nonetheless, didn't make it very far into the race before having something that would take some pace out of their ultimate chamber.
But even that being said, their pace throughout the entire weekend was very strong, and we had both talked about Cadillac being a car that we were going to be watching. It was your pick, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
I was disappointed when you took that pick. So we were all on the same boat in, we knew that the Cadillac V Series R was going to be strong here at COTA, and it did turn out to be strong at COTA. Despite all of these setbacks that they had, they still ended up with a very good finish. And I think even despite all of these setbacks that they had, they were not, it wasn't their doing at the end of the day. The contact that happened right on the race start did result in a penalty for, if I'm not mistaken, it resulted in a penalty for the offending party, and Cadillac ultimately was able to drive or come back from this in a race that featured no safety cars. So I think that says a lot about the Cadillac team, and even though that they haven't had the season that they've wanted, that is a team that is showing signs of taking steps forward, and going forward into next year with COTA coming into the mix. It's going to be exciting to see the potential of that car and what two Cadillacs on the grid can really do.
Yeah, I think I've touched on that before. I think this is a big win for both parties in terms of COTA and Cadillac going into 2025. I think COTA is really going to benefit by having that factory support behind them. And Cadillac is going to benefit from having a two-car team with a team that has won already in the WEC this season. Despite the fact that Chip Ganassi Racing has been struggling in one way or another, be it pace or even when they have pace, they just run into something that costs them the win or a real chance at the win. They haven't been able to show the true potential of that program, I think, what it's really worth. But I do want to take it back a little bit. I don't want to get to jump all the way to the finish quite already. I actually want to go back to qualifying and touch on some of the LMGT3 entrants as well. It was the first pole position of the year for Ian James in the Heart of Racing Aston Martin Vantage GT3 Evo. First pole position in the championship for that team, their second year in the World Endurance Championship. And finally, sort of breaking the monotony we've seen of Manthey Racing success in at least the qualifying sessions, but also the races as well. I think Manthey was really the one that stood out to me as well from qualifying. Going into this race, I mentioned last week, is there really any team that's going to be able to bring the fight to them? Ultimately, the answer to this race was yes. But those two cars didn't have, I guess, the greatest qualifying that they could have hoped for, with the number 92 car qualifying 4th on the grid and the number 91 car qualifying down in 16th. I want you to remember that, though, before we get to the finish, because that will be coming back and it's pretty important. Two championship leading cars in that class. And then also in LMGT3, how many times, if it's not every single race at this point, how many times am I going to say that the Iron Dames Lamborghini is cursed at this point? Because that 85 car, no matter what it is, and they had a rough weekend, actually, for what it's worth, in the 4 Hours of Spa and the ELMS last weekend as well. Hoping to just maybe get any inch of luck in the World Endurance Championship this year. And sure enough, they're fighting for the podium pretty much the entire first half of the race or so, but ended up having some contact with the number 81 TF Sport Corvette, which, was that your pick? It was either that car or it was the other TF Corvette. I can't remember.
I can't remember which car. It was a Corvette for sure.
Yeah, I think it was the other one. Ultimately getting some rear suspension damage, needing to go to the garage. I think they fell down to P17 out of the garage and then managed to fight their way back up to a P13 finish, albeit out of the points. So just another race for the Iron Dames Lamborghini that we're talking about could have had a podium here, probably should have had a podium, and it's another race with no points on the board leaving the weekend, which surely the tides have to turn. We have 2 races left this season. I might have picked them once this season, but I haven't picked them any more than that. So I'd like to imagine that I'm not cursing them, but
yet,
whatever it may be, it's been a very tough season for them so far.
Yeah, it's been difficult to watch. You know, it's a car that has showed so much pace, and we know that this is a not only a team but a stable of drivers that are capable of winning, and they've proven the speed that they have, and it's difficult to see this tough stretch that they're going through. But you know, if they keep showing this speed, it's all going to come together at some point, and we saw it all come together for them last year. You have to think it's only a matter of time. So Iron Dames, it's a difficult time to be an Iron Dames fan for sure, but yeah, you have to be pleased with what you're seeing pace wise. They were fast all weekend, and sometimes the cards don't fall your way, but you know, these things happen in sports car racing and all forms of racing in general. So it's gonna go their way at some point. I don't really think there's any other way to say it.
Well, we've got the season finale, 8 Hours of Bahrain, where you just mentioned they picked up that first win last year. Maybe they're able to back that one up this year, or perhaps they're able to find something in Fuji as well.
True.
I did make it sound a little bit worse for them than really it might be. They are still sitting 8th in the championship right now, pretty close to the 777 D Station Racing Aston Martin for 7th. And then actually also not far behind the 46 WRT BMW. But they do have 2 retirements this season at Imola, and then also the last previous race out at Sao Paulo. So we'll have to see. It's just been a season, like I said, a season for them to forget so far. And maybe they'll turn that around in the last couple of races.
Yeah.
Also, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to jump ahead to the race. So let's save that.
well, we can keep talking about the race. I want to talk about Sebastian Buemi in the number 8 Toyota, because I'm not too sure what the motive was for the contact with the number 6 Porsche going on to the long straightaway. I know the Porsche was who was just coming out of the pits? Oh man, I should have watched this race live. It was the Toyota just coming out of the pits, I believe, and I don't know if you're going to know the answer to this either. But on cooler tires and trying to defend off the faster with warmer tires number 6 Porsche, ultimately driving them all the way to the inside wall on that long straightaway. Actually reminiscent of what we saw in one of the Formula One races there with Alonso, and I forget who else was involved in that back in like 2022, I believe. No cars got airborne here, but ultimately
Thankfully.
The number 8 Toyota did pick up a puncture. So sort of a self-inflicted penalty for Sebastian Buemi, but then also the FIA threw the rule book at them as well and gave them a proper penalty on top of that. Just unnecessary. I've watched it back now a few times. I really don't understand the motive for it. You talk about looking at the long picture here when you're a team, especially a team as Toyota, who I think we've associated with being a very mature team in the championship now. They've been around since 2012. It's just the last thing I would have expected out of a team like that. Maybe not quite the last thing I would have expected out of Buemi as a driver, if we're being brutally honest. But just from that team itself, a move that really I think is kind of unprecedented from them.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. Unprecedented. You wouldn't expect it from Toyota. It was... this was something I was able to watch live, and I was rather surprised to see it, to say the least. So, honestly, I think good on the WEC as well. You mentioned, throwing the rule back at them. It was still deserved, even though there was a self-inflicted wound as a result of it. I think this is important. We talk a lot about sanctioning bodies and sometimes how the inconsistency of calls can cause some frustration. I think this very much a deserved penalty, and at the end of the day, the double whammy did ruin their race. So unfortunate to see from a car that we would expect to see to be relatively strong, but very much deserved. And you really question what was going through Buemi's head when all of this was going on. It's difficult to say in the heat of the moment, but not something that we want to see a ton of for sure.
Yeah, I mean, they are the second fiddle Toyota in the championship right now, behind the number 7 car. It's not like they're not really in the fight for the championship battle. Really, they're way out of it. I don't know. It just raised a lot of question marks to me that it seemed really unnecessary. You sort of hinted on the fact that it ruined their race. They did finish way down in 15th. They were out of the points this race. So don't know. I don't know if there's a whole lot more to say about it, but it was just very surprising and very un-Toyota-like, which I've already touched on a couple times now. Also, not a great race for the pole-sitting number 51 AF Corsa Ferrari. They ended up having contact with one of the Lexi. number 78 car. How many times are we gonna? Somebody's just got to tell us if it's right. You know what? We'll ask at one of the IMSA races in the autograph session or something. We'll try to get an exclusive on that.
Good call.
At least see what Vassar Sullivan thinks. But some contact between that car and the number 78 Lexus that ultimately damaged the number 51 499P, causing an issue with their driveline, and ultimately causing a retirement from that car. Again, we're just talking about this with Toyota, that is not the leading Ferrari in the championship, but nonetheless still really took them out of a position to not only fight for the race win, but also play a team player to the other Ferraris that were up fighting for the win as well, trying to hold off some of the other cars that were contending them for that victory. So just another race that the 51 Ferrari is going to want to forget, and what so far has been a pretty forgetful season for them, riding off that high of a Le Mans victory last year, but this year hasn't been ultimately quite as kind to them. Also want to touch on perhaps the most controversial aspect of this race, I think, which was the finish. Or not quite the finish, but within the last hour of the race, the number 7 Toyota picking up a penalty whilst leading the race. This was indicated that it was not for... Can we get this right? It was for not slowing down for the number 94 Peugeot, which was stopped on the long straightaway outside of turn 11. WEC ruled that the number 7 Toyota did not make any attempt to slow down while the full course yellow or the local yellow boards were being waved, and as a result they got a drive-through penalty in the last hour of the race. Cost them the lead, and you can make the argument it pretty much ultimately cost them the race victory as well. Handed the lead back over to the number 83, of course a Ferrari, who, despite a very close finish, actually the second closest finish in WEC history, under 2 seconds. I think it was 1.7 seconds at the finish. And a real last-hour charge from Kamui Kobayashi came up short in a race that really could have been an important race in the championship for that number 7 car in the bid for that championship lead.
Yeah, a really close ending, and watching the final, half hour, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever you were able to see of the end of this race, the Toyota was charging hard, and it's going to be a story of what could have been for that car. If the drive-through doesn't happen, we're probably talking about them on the top step of the podium. But ultimately, these things happen, and 1.7 seconds, around a track like COTA, that's a pretty long track, that's a couple of laps potentially is what led to it. There was a bit of traffic there at the end, and man, a really good finish though to this race. Even removing the penalty, it's always difficult to see a penalty decide a race, but ultimately, we'd be talking about something completely different if this is something that the sanctioning body, the WEC, let off the hook. So rules are rules, and these are the results that we have to deal with. But regardless, from a fan perspective, man, this is a good finish to this race.
Definitely an exciting finish. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but I do want to get your thoughts on the penalty situation in the World Endurance Championship. I think we're talking an awful lot on this podcast about, you have two sides here. You have IMSA, who is perhaps a little bit too lenient on the penalty game, despite the fact that they have been showing improvements in recent races. I'll give them credit. And I think in the World Endurance Championship, maybe you could make the argument that penalties are handed out way too freely. I'll be honest, I tried to count how many penalties were assigned in this race to give us a number on the podcast. I gave up. It was a lot. And to be honest with you, just too many that I just didn't want to bother keeping count. But we're seeing penalties for cars not lifting off for a local yellow or a full course yellow. We're seeing penalties for track limits an awful lot as well. Do you think that there's a sort of middle ground that needs to be had here, or do you think that this is something that the World Endurance Championship should continue doing?
I don't know. This is something, as you were talking there, this is kind of something that we find a lot with a lot of the things that we discuss on this show is we see the WEC and IMSA kind of being not necessarily, I don't think polar opposites is the right word, but we see them far apart on a lot of these big topics. We see this on penalties where, the WEC is, you're getting a penalty if there's no question about it. There's, you were talking about, there's a lot of penalties. In IMSA, there's probably not enough. There's probably a lot that gets, swept off to the side and that, have at it type of racing. We also see this sort of reflected in full course yellows as well, whereas, IMSA is going to be very quick to throw a full course yellow, bring out the safety car, bunch up the field, have at it again. The WEC, and I understand that there's a lot of differences between the tracks that these series go to, tools for these full course yellow or caution periods that each sanctioning body has access to or that they have implemented within their regulations. But we do see polar opposites on that front as well. And, there is definitely a middle ground on both of those things that the series can come to. But I guess as fans, is it a bad thing that we have these two series that are completely different? For diehard fans, it does provide two distinctly sort of viewing experiences. When you're watching the race, that can definitely be a detriment to newer fans who are trying to just jump into the sports car racing world, and they watch the WEC race at COTA and they say, oh, okay, that's clearly a penalty, I understand that, and then they flip on the IMSA race and it's, well, that was a race a few weeks ago when I watched it, or that was a penalty a few weeks ago when I watched it, why is that not a penalty now? I guess all of this is to say, to answer your question, sure, there's a middle ground that we can fall into on this, but there's probably a broader discussion of, do we want to find the middle ground on this, or do we want to have two distinctly different championships? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know my opinion on that sitting here in this moment, but it is probably something that we need to think about, because yeah, there were a lot of penalties at COTA. But there's a middle ground to everything. It's just, I guess, what is the middle ground, and what do we ultimately want to see with the racing product on track?
Right, and well, I personally think IMSA and the WEC are always going to be separated, at least in terms of how they handle their on-track product. For whether you think it's a positive or a negative, the IMSA product is a lot more, we'll just call it Americanized. I think certain teams have labeled them the same before as well. It does provide a lot more close finishes a lot more often, mainly because you mentioned we're stacking up the field. We're being more lenient when it comes to getting the bumper out, so a lot more teams are inclined to do so. Again, whether that's a positive or a negative, you could swing it both ways. My thing with the WEC, and it's not just this season, I've sort of noted this for a while now, is they have a ton of data that they're getting their hands onto at this point in time, and they can really throw the book at you for a wide range of things that probably 10, 15 years ago would have gone not only unpenalized, but probably completely unnoticed. So, things for not lifting off for a local yellow when the car is stopped on the side of the track, already parked there. Is it really the driver's discretion to say, no, I didn't think there was any danger there, I wasn't going to slow down? Probably not. You can at least you need to weigh on the side of consistency in a situation like that, which I would like to imagine they are doing. But at the same time, by penalizing a team like Toyota, you really are putting yourself in a position where you can't let other cases like that slip through the cracks. So I don't really know right now. I can't sit here and tell you that they're letting other small infringements like that go unpenalized, but I would have to imagine that there's a chance of it. And that's really where I sit right now. If we take the opportunity to penalize every small infringement, I think you're taking away from the product as a whole. Just my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, you know what? You raise a very interesting point there in that this is 100%. Well, I don't know. I don't necessarily want to say it's 100% fine in my books, this penalty, because you brought up a lot of good points there. But the really important part of all of this is the consistency. If there is an instance where whether it's in the future, whether it's happened in the past, where you have a car that does not lift going past the local yellow, it's very clear cut and defined at this point. Even if you are, the leader of the race, you're set to, cruise off to a COTA victory. Like if you're gonna get if the car in that position is going to get penalized for it, you have to penalize every single instance of it. And there is absolutely no excuse going forward as to why a penalty shouldn't be handed out for that exact infringement. If they have been handing out infringements for every instance of this that has happened in the past and are going to continue to do so, at least for the remainder of the season, I have no problem with it. But it's all about that consistency. There can be zero gray area in this with the data that they are receiving, as you mentioned. This is a direct result of the data that they are receiving from the cars. You have to be very consistent with this going forward, and as long as they do that, I'm okay with it. But it's about the consistency. Yeah.
Well, this isn't the first time we're talking about controversial finishes related to penalties or lack thereof in the WEC this year. We were talking about the same thing after the 24 Hours of Le Mans. I can point to the door issue with the number 50 Ferrari at the end of Le Mans this year, where they had a long time before they were really dinged on that issue. And you look back at Spa, Neil Yanni, I believe, was in the car with the 99 Proton 963, had a lot less time before they were black and white flagged and told to come into the pits to shut the door. So this is where, me personally, I'm starting to pick up on the fact that maybe there are some inconsistencies in these rulings, and of course there always will be. If you're working with a high-pressure, high-stakes race like the 24 Hours of Le Mans, you're juggling a million different things. I'm sure that race control is not going to have as much time to look into an issue like that as they would under a safety car at Spa. But what it's going to do in return is bring up a lot of talking points after the race. Because if the 50 Ferrari was told to come in earlier at Le Mans this year, we'd be probably talking about a different winner of that race. So I don't know. That's where I stand on it right now. I would, in an ideal world, we would sort of move away from penalizing every minor incident we possibly can, because number one, I think it's deterring from the actual skill that we're seeing put out on track from a lot of these drivers to really take a result away from them for the smallest infringement over the course of a 6-hour race with, as you mentioned, no safety cars. Doesn't sit quite right with me, but we'll see if they continue down that path in the future.
Yeah, it's going to be something that is, now that it is, I mean, it is something that we've discussed in different ways in previous episodes, after previous races. But now that it's just one more thing that we're going to be looking out for, and if it comes up again, is going to be criticized much more heavily. So hopefully we don't find ourselves talking about this. I mean, you would definitely agree that we want to be talking about the racing action, that the battles that are taking place out on track more than, these penalties. But hopefully this isn't something that we're talking about again.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the battles on track if we can, because as you touched on, what that did set up for us was a very close finish between the 83 Ferrari and the number 7 Toyota. I already touched on how close that battle actually was at the finish. Only finish that was closer in WEC history was between the two factory Porsches back in 2017 at the same track. Although that was sort of a staged photo finish op that was under the discretion of team orders, so I'm not going to qualify it as exactly the same. Kobayashi, I think, was giving it 110% at the finish. You could see that he was really pushing that car hard. You mentioned he ran into some traffic at the end of the race. Also went off track with, I think, 2 laps to go in the first turn as well. Probably exhausted any possible opportunity he had, but ultimately it was a cat and mouse game at the end of the race that, give it another lap or two, maybe we could have been talking about a different winner. But nonetheless, it was a first victory of the season for the number 50, I keep getting it wrong, number 83 customer, AF Corsa Ferrari. Interestingly enough, because that is the customer Ferrari, Toyota actually walked out of this race with the most points in the manufacturer's championship because of the fact that they are only counting the factory cars towards that championship. But it was a first win of the season and a first win outside of the 24 Hours of Le Mans for that Ferrari. And it was also the second customer win of the season in the World Endurance Championship this year, after the number 12 Jota's win at the 6 Hours of Spa. A lot to unpack there, but I think it was a very deserved victory from that trio right there.
Yeah, it was. It was clear in the early going of this race, especially that Ferrari were strong. Honestly, if you would have asked me if I thought that the 83 was going to be the one to emerge victorious, I would not have thought that that was going to be the case. But they ran a great race. They obviously ran a great race if they came out on top, but they took advantage of everything that was given to them. That the penalty to the number 7 being the biggest boost that they were given in this race. But good to see another privateer win. That is definitely good to see. We talk about IMSA. We haven't really seen the privateer entries be truly in the hunt for race victories, and we have seen that in the WEC. We saw Jota win earlier this year. We're seeing an AF Corsa Ferrari that's not the factory entry taking the victory here, beating out a lot of factory outfits. So good for the 83. The fact that that Toyota was so strong as well, I think just another good thing to see. I feel like Toyota, despite everything that they've done the past few seasons, I feel like they haven't been in the spotlight as much this year. They've had some strong runs, but I feel like we've talked a lot about Porsche and a lot about Ferrari being very, very strong throughout the entire season. It's good to see Toyota having a good strong run here, and we talked about it off the top of the show, but Cadillac, you got to think of what could have been if they don't have what happened to them at the beginning of this race. They were really strong. Could we be talking about Cadillac on the podium in their home race? We'll never know, but a positive race for them.
Yeah, I do want to touch on Toyota just one more time because we were drawing similarities to this track and I guess this race with what we saw at Le Mans a couple of months ago. And I think we saw a similar story from the consistency of Toyota here, and just how surprising their actual race pace was compared to where they were in qualifying. The number 7 car only qualified in ninth, and yet in the race, had everything gone down with no penalties, they would have won this race. And of course, they were aided by the fact that Cadillac didn't have a perfect race. The 51 Ferrari retired. But ultimately, you can't fault that team with the amount of race pace that they've been showing this year. They obviously were very strong in Sao Paulo. I think they had the best ultimate pace at that track. But here, going into the race weekend, it looked like another weekend where they potentially could have struggled. And just like they did at the finish of Le Mans this year, they were able to extract absolute performance out of that car and put it in a position where I think it really should have won this race. Really positive for them, I think, going into their home race at Fuji in a couple of weeks' time, which really, if you're Toyota, is the second most important race of the season, hands down. And one that I think, even if they don't have the best qualifying pace that weekend, I think they're going to be an extremely strong team when it comes to the race.
Yeah, I think, you nailed it there. They're going to be strong in Fuji. Home race. Yeah.
Kicking over to LMGT3. I told you to remember one thing with that class earlier. I told you to remember the fact that one of the Manthey Racing Porsches qualified down in 16th. Well, I also mentioned that somebody was able to stop them this race for the first time since Imola. And that was the Heart of Racing, number 27 Heart of Racing Aston Martin, finally picking up their first win in the World Endurance Championship, backing up their first pole position. Really a pretty flawless weekend from them. Talking about controlling the race, we talked about this at VIR over in IMSA in the last episode. They were able to control this race as well. It was a race that they did have some competition, especially earlier on in the race, but just without making a whole lot of mistakes, were able to control and hold on to that lead for the majority of the race, and came down to a race win for them in pretty controlling fashion. Now, I do want to touch over on Manthey, because despite their relatively poor effort in qualifying by their standards, were able to close out the podium with the number 92 car in second place and the number 91 car in third. Again, that's the one that started down in 16th. And if you want to talk about damage limitation, doesn't get a whole lot better than that. I mean, they could have picked up the race win, sure, but to go from 16th on the grid all the way back to third and retain second place in the championship, I think for the number 91 car, absolutely everything they had to do here.
Yeah. I've said this a couple times. Spot on. Manthey, even though they weren't the quickest here, just another very strong weekend for both of those Porsches. Really have been they've been the most consistent of any of the cars in the LMGT3 class. It seems like every race this season, we've been talking about them towards the front of this class, and while they didn't show the ultimate pace of one of the Aston Martins, there's not much else to say other than this is just a performance that we expect out of these cars at this point. So Manthey, another really strong effort, and a well-deserved double podium for them.
Yeah, especially in a championship where you talk about a bad race in IMSA. A bad race in IMSA, you're still going to walk out of it with points as long as you were actually able to start the race. A bad race in the WEC is really anything outside of the top 10. Because if you're outside of the top 10, you're walking out with 0 points. And when the leader's walking out with 25, you're going to see a pretty heavy swing. And we actually saw that coming out of Sao Paulo with both of the Manthey Porsches leaving Sao Paulo, or entering Sao Paulo rather, on equal points. The number 92 car was able to pick up a race win there, get the full 25 points, whilst the number 91 car was able to, or weren't able to finish in the points, and they picked up a 12th place finish there, walking out with nothing. So for them to pull off a result like that here, again, really just shows leaps and bounds to what they were able to achieve, given the sort of hand that they were dealt at the start of the race from their qualifying results. A couple questions that I want to get to in the chat. Actually, you know what? Let's go over the championship results first. I do want to go over, because we have 2 races left in the WEC this year, only Fuji and Bahrain remaining, with Bahrain being an elevated points race, being an 8-hour race, with the winner picking up 38 points at that race versus 25 and so on down the board. But it is still that number 6 Porsche in first place in the hypercar class. Despite their not perfect race here at COTA, they were able to still pick up a 6th place finish, ultimately the worst finish for that car this season. But for them, just walking out of that race with any points, I think is a big achievement for them. Lucky they weren't able to, or lucky they didn't pick up any additional damage from the contact with the number 8 Toyota. That really could have been very costly for them. But they're still holding a pretty decent points lead over the number 7 Toyota in second place, which is a 12-point lead at this time. Third place, it is the number 50 Le Mans winning AF Corsa Ferrari. Got a podium here at COTA, but again, still looking for that second race win this year. They've come close on a couple of occasions now. They really came pretty close here at COTA as well. They had a lot of pace here, but ultimately not quite as much as the sister 83 car. They are sitting actually equal footing with Toyota number 7 at 113 points compared to 125 from the championship leading number 6 car. Over in LMGT3, shouldn't come as a surprise. We're talking about Manthey in the top 2 right now with the 92 car over the 91. I just mentioned that big point swing that happened in Sao Paulo. That was elevated a little bit here by the number 92 car, one-upping the 91, finishing in second instead of third. That points deficit is up to 28 points at this point in time. Or if you're thinking in WEC points math, is over a full race, at least for the next race at the 6 hours of Fuji. So 91 cars really on the comeback here, but I just mentioned a couple minutes ago how costly relatively poor races are in this championship. And if the number 92 car finds themselves out of the top 10 for the first time this season, at least in terms of points, because they did pick up a single point at Le Mans for being the 10th car that raced in the full season, then that could really swing to their teammates. Third place is still the number 31 WRT BMW, who's been hanging on there for quite a while now after their win at Imola back earlier on in this season. Stu, any closing thoughts from you on the 6 hours of COTA, the Lone Star Le Mans, before I kick over to some questions from that race?
Yeah, the thing that really stuck out to me, we've talked a lot about hypercar, but I think the thing that stuck out to me the most, and it wasn't just in the 6 hours of COTA, this is also applied a bit on the IMSA side of things as well, is just what the Heart of Racing is doing right now. The Heart of Racing, they showed up this weekend, and I don't know if there's... it was a very impressive performance that they put down in that LMGT3 class, and it wasn't just in the race. It was all weekend that team really excelled. They seem to be really finding their groove with that new car, both in the WEC and in IMSA. And I said it after the race. This looks like a team that is ready to step up to the next level. You know, we've seen multiple teams over the past few years, especially with the introduction of, you know, LMDH and the influx of new LMH entries that we've seen here in the WEC. There's been a lot of teams that have stepped up and rose up to the occasion of fielding one of these top flight prototype cars. And I think there's a very good chance that we're going to be talking about the heart of racing right in with, your with the likes of, Jota, who are going to be stepping up to a factory outlet, all of these teams that have all risen to the occasion. And the heart of racing look ready for that next step. And I'm very excited to see what they're going to do with that Aston Martin LMH, both in the WEC and in IMSA. And yeah, that's the one of the main takeaways for me from this weekend is just how impressive the heart of racing was, and all the more excited for what they're going to be able to do in the future.
Well, you know what? They're pretty much a perfect example of progression, if you ask me. In the WeatherTech Championship, they started out in GTD. They were able to find race wins there. They make the jump up, at least with one car, to GTD Pro. They're able to find wins there. Now they're in the World Endurance Championship as well. They took over one of the Aston Martin programs at the start of last year. Now they've picked up a pole and a race win there as well. The next logical step for them is to go up to prototype racing, and we're going to see them in the hypercar class next year. As you mentioned, we've talked about this plenty now with that dual IMSA WEC program that I'm extremely excited about, with the V12 Cosworth powered Valkyrie road-based Le Mans hypercar. I don't know. The sky's the limit for that team. I'm very curious to see what performance we're going to see from them in prototype racing next year. It's a completely new chapter for them. Up until this point, they've stayed relatively close to their home base of GT racing. But I think next year is going to be the big test for them. But ultimately, so far, haven't done a whole lot of... or they've proved us wrong plenty of times already, I think.
I think, these last couple of seasons for the Heart of Racing and some of the things that they've experienced as a team, I understand that when they took over the Northwest AMR program, that, a lot of that team was staying largely intact from what was sort of existing with that program. But the fact that, they were thrown into the deep end a little bit with that, and just going from there to now winning races in the WEC, turning over the calendar to the 2024 season, and having to learn I understand that it is technically an Evo version of the Vantage that they're running right now, but learning a largely new car and how they've picked up on it in both championships and been able to turn that into a winning entry in both championships now is very impressive. I know you're going to be keeping a very close eye on them next season when they move up to the hypercar ranks and to the GTP ranks, and I think a lot of people are for very good reason.
I was going to say, who isn't? Actually, we did hear as well that they will be continuing GT racing in some form, one way or another, next year as well. Not officially yet, but something that came out of Daily SportsCar either yesterday or today. I will link that in the description for you to go check out yourself. But great to see them sort of sticking with their bread and butter next year, at least in some capacity as well. Sounds like we're going to be continuing to see them in the LMGT3 class in the WEC. Going over some questions, at least related to the Lone Star Le Mans. Someone saying, I think the 8 car is the weaker of the Toyotas. I think this year that's a fair assessment, sure. I think it honestly fluctuates based on the season. If you had asked me a couple of years ago, especially back in the LMP1 era, I would have told you that the 8 car was the stronger of the 2 cars. I think recently, especially it seems in the hypercar era, the number 7 car has been stronger. They had a very unfortunate retirement at Le Mans in 2023, but they were the better of the 2 cars at Le Mans this year, very close to picking up a race win. I think that's a pretty fair assessment for this year, but I do think the 8 car, even though they have shuffled their driver lineup a little bit more, I do still think that is a championship capable team. They've proven it plenty of times before, so I wouldn't put it behind them to come out the stronger of the two Toyotas in the future. Robert Kubica was on record of saying he might want to jump to a factory team in 2025. His performances at COTA might have been an audition. Yeah, it's definitely not a bad thing to put on your resume. A win in the hypercar category against the massive competition they're seeing in that class right now. I would have to imagine, just doing a quick mental check of where there might be openings next year, at least in a factory effort. I know Joda's lineup has been rumored to be shuffled around a little bit next year. They're going to have that Cadillac factory backing behind them. So potentially maybe there's an opening there for him to step up. We'll have to see, though. I think that's one of the stories that we're going to hear about over the offseason, but definitely a good thing for him to carry on into 2025 if he does want to try to jump up into a fully fledged factory back seat. Although I will say, on note of that 83 Ferrari, I don't think they're really disadvantaged compared to the team cars. We didn't really see any team orders here internally from AF Corsa because it is the same team running that customer car and the factory cars. Earlier in the race this year, they let the 83 car lead. I think, honestly, if it's up to me, I think the 83 car was a shout to win Le Mans this year if they didn't have the reliability issues at the end of the race. They were very strong there as well. I can't imagine that Ferrari would have taken that one away from them either compared to the factory cars. I don't think that 83 car is really a bad place to be sitting right now, even amongst some of those proper factory, fully factory-backed hypercars in the class.
I agree.
Nick DeVries was putting in some great stints. I love this team name. Visa Cash App RB's loss is Toyota's gain. It's a definition of a driver who struggled a little bit in the World Endurance Championship in F1, but coming back over to the WEC where he had some success in the LMP2 ranks a few years ago, and it's been stepping back into it pretty nicely for the first season back. I think he's been earning his chips there, we'll just say that much, especially with some of the performances he put in earlier this year back at Imola, for example, where he helped a team pick up the win there. Also, this ties back to when we were discussing the yellow flags and the penalties related to it in this race, at least. Begs the question, should they even bother with local yellows? It's a lot of... there's a lot happening during these races very fast, and it caught some veteran drivers out. This was something that was asked on the broadcast. If it's a real safety concern, why don't you just throw a full course yellow and slow all the cars down to 60 kilometers per hour? If that's really going to be a concern. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it one way or the other, to be honest with you. I think the local yellows really have their purpose. We're talking about pretty large grid sizes right now. We're going to be up to 40 cars, or at least a maximum of 40 cars for next season. We're at 36 right now, right? 36 cars, I believe, with the loss of Asada. Yeah, we're at 36.
Yes.
We do have pretty hefty car fields compared to, if you want to compare it to F1. I do think the local yellows really have their place. The question I have is, should they be regulated as heavily as they are being right now, where you're getting, as you mentioned, some veteran drivers caught out and some penalties assigned that ultimately impact races? I think that's the real question that's up for debate.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was thinking through in my head, what's the purpose that these serve? Why couldn't you just, throw full course yellow? Well, in the case, if there's a car stopped on the side of the track and you're expecting it to potentially get moving again within a very reasonable amount of time, then that doesn't really warrant slowing down the racing all over the circuit.
Unless you're NASCAR.
unless you're NASCAR. It's only sometimes in NASCAR. We don't want to get into the officiating standards there, but yeah, it does beg the question. But then you also quickly realize that these do serve they do serve a purpose, but are they to be penalized as heavily and as strictly as this? Perhaps that's where the question and the arguments align. Well, Mr. Waffles has just mentioned in the chat at least a warning. I think one of the things that popped into my mind earlier in this show when we were talking about some of these penalties is we see some of these warnings handed out in multiple championships, but in IMSA for tire pressure. There's a tire pressure warning that are issued to cars if they're found to be operating outside with the live tire pressure sensors and the data that they have access to. Teams are issued a warning for tire pressures being outside of the permitted range. Maybe this is something that could be, a warning system implemented for things like this, where, okay, one time it happens, this isn't a dire situation. There's not track workers on the track or anything like that. Maybe a warning is more applicable here. And then if after the warning, if it happens again, then a penalty is certainly warranted. But there's got to be a different way to do it.
Sure. Yeah. What was the deal with Jota sending the 12 car up multiple times for it to stop / slow a few laps later? That was a question that was brought up plenty of times. I think, mainly for them just trying to diagnose the issue, I think is the team's reasoning as to why they're sending the car out on track. If you're the championship, you might want to try to put your foot in there and put an end to that, because you're running into a situation where, yes, this car might have stopped on track in a place where they're not able to retrieve it. You need to then throw a full course yellow or a safety car to go get the car. It really interrupts the entire race. Luckily, we didn't really have a situation where that was the case here. But I'm curious if that's something that they try to regulate in future races, because ultimately, as you mentioned here, they sort of tried and failed multiple times to get that car out on track with a normal level of performance without a whole lot of success. This is a relatively hot take. I guess we'll go into it a little bit. I think GT3 competitiveness is a failure, to be honest. In the WEC, I don't know. I don't know if I would say that's entirely fair. You can look at Manthey as being extremely strong this year, and yes, there are definitely favorites. But I don't think that the class itself has been struggling from competition, at least especially on a number of cars that we have in the class. We're talking about potentially having 20 cars in that class next year. But I don't think that's what you're going for. I think you're talking about it just in terms of how close the racing is in that class. Yes, I would say, sure, for the lead, we might not have seen as many lead battles this year, at least between different manufacturers, as we might have hoped for. But around the entire class as a whole, I think that you're dealing with a lot of teams right now that have different levels of experience with this championship. It's a new experience for the WEC to try to balance these cars to the best of their ability. And it's also an amateur-based class. Let's remember that at the end of the day as well. So a bronze driver for one team might be completely different pace-wise from a bronze driver on another team. So I don't know if that's a fair assessment to make at this point in time, but hopefully we'll see some improvement over the coming seasons, because I do think GT3 is really here to stay in this championship for the long-term future.
Yeah, you hit on a lot of the points that I was going to there. The fact that this is the first year of of this category in the World Endurance Championship. This is the first time that they're trying to do a BOP for these cars as well. There's so many variables that are in play here. Yeah, sure. There's definitely an argument to be had that, Porsche has been and those Manthey cars have been the clear cut, they've been so strong from start to finish, but at a certain point, you have to also acknowledge the team and the job that they've done as well. There is a part of this that is chalked up to maybe the performance levels that they're granted, but there's also a significant portion of this that is, you have to give credit to the teams, the drivers, the engineers that are preparing these cars, and give them credit where credit is due. With that being said, if we're still talking about this being like this at this point next year, then maybe that's a different discussion that we're having. But it can be difficult to compare, the WEC to IMSA, who have been dealing with these GT3 spec cars for years now, and what we're seeing there. You mentioned the bronze drivers for these cars having a significant impact on the finishing. The silver rated drivers as well, a huge impact. We hear super silvers talked about all the time, and how a super silver, who is, if you're not familiar with the term, being a silver rated driver that is probably should be higher rated than that. They should be a gold rated driver. How valuable those drivers can be, and that can be kind of an ace in your sleeve. So there's a lot of factors that go into the level of competitiveness, not only in the World Endurance Championship, but in lots of other GT3 championships around the world. And I think we have seen enough competitiveness. We've seen close enough competition from a lot of the other cars that it's not something that's weighing heavily on my mind. But if it is something that flips over to next year, and we don't see the likes of a lot of these other manufacturers stepping up, then maybe it is something that could be more of a talking point next year.
Well, I think there's a good amount to discuss just in the fact that it is an amateur-based class, because we're not talking about each manufacturer's best of the best team, best of the best drivers that they're running in each car, as we probably saw back in the GTE days, or as you might see in some other GT3 championships. You can make the argument that the IMSA GTD Pro drivers are higher qualified, or GT World Challenge. We're seeing a lot more top-level factory talent there, as you would expect. Now, the comparison I'm going to draw here is over in IMSA. How many times, Stu, have you and I talked about how dominant Windward Racing has been this year, or how dominant Paul Miller Racing was in GTD last year? I think when you look at a class that's based on a Pro-Am formula or a Pro-Am driver lineup, it's going to really become apparent who has that best, we'll just call it the best formula. Whereas if you're talking about a fully pro-based class, you're talking about the best teams. You're talking about the best drivers for those teams. And I think that's where you're seeing a lot more competition at the front. Whereas in these Pro-Am/Am based classes, usually you're starting to see the favorites make their way to the front pretty early on, just because of the way they've they've played their hand the best with the driver ranking cards that they have to deal. Yeah,
you're completely right. The level of variability that we can see in these Pro-Am classes is pretty large, and it's always going to be like this to a certain extent, right? These Am drivers, they're going to have good tracks. They're going to have some tracks that aren't as great. They're going to have just seasons in general where everything is working for them. They have more time in their life because, again, they are working professionals, that they're going to have more time where they can test or, prepare for races. There's so many variables in these championships, especially these Pro-Am championships, that we could dig into it in an entire episode, I'm sure. But yeah, I think that's one of the things about GT racing or GT3 racing and these Pro-Am championships in general is teams can come out and have a barn burner of a season, and they can be well prepared, have a barn burner of a season regardless of what the perceived performance of their car is. And we're probably still going to sit here criticizing, that 3-letter word a little bit. So
not a year later, we're not.
No.
And then just a closing thought, just since you mentioned it in the chat. The problem is bronze drivers like Malikan and Ian James shouldn't be bronze. There's definitely a lot larger of a case to be made for that. And as you mentioned, Stu, with super silvers as well, drivers who are silver in name only or classification only, but really have the performance level of a gold driver. That ties into a much larger controversy with FIA driver rankings that really aren't that big a deal in most championships.
Yeah.
Except for when you're starting to enforce bronze drivers to be in each team, or you're enforcing silver drivers on each team. That's when you really start to see the difference of a top tier silver driver, or we'll just call him a super silver, might be 2 seconds a lap faster or more than a traditional silver driver or just any other silver driver at a track like COTA. And if we're talking a 6-hour race with no safety cars, and let's say they're doing a 2-hour stint, you're talking well over a minute probably.
Yeah.
That they're able to make up over the course of their stint alone. So really what it boils down to is, I think, who has the best formula, again, with the cars that they have to work with. And that really is the amateur drivers. Who has the best amateur driver and the most consistent amateur drivers, I think, is really what sets the LMGT3 and also the GTD class in IMSA apart right now.
Yeah. It's an interesting discussion to have when we get into these driver ratings, especially with these bronze rated drivers, because we've talked about this a lot, that these championships, sports car racing as a whole is very much either on the rise or peaking, whatever phase you want to say that it's at. When things peter out, whether they level off, whether it declines slightly, you really need that bronze driver base that is bringing money in to support these race programs. And telling Ben Keating, for instance, that he's not a bronze rated driver anymore, that he's a silver rated driver, at the end of the day, that probably hurts the sport as a whole, and that's not what you want to do. So it's such a fine line that we walk with these driver ratings. We're going to have instances where we need to come up with a good name for these great bronze drivers, because we have super silver, which is fun to call those drivers. Yeah, I was trying to think of it on the spot, what goes with bronze, but if anybody has any ideas, let us know in the chat.
Beaming bronze.
There we go. But we're always going to have these outliers, and that's you live by the driver rating system, you die by the driver rating system, right? And there's going to be outliers regardless. So I wouldn't peg it as the only problem that we have here. There's going to be a lot of variables within a Pro-Am class, but it is worth talking about. The driver rating system can play a lot into a team's success over the course of a season, in the course of a race, especially if they can capitalize with a really good bronze driver or a really good silver driver.
Last point I want to make on this, just because I saw another message in the chat related to it, is Ben Keating still a bronze? He's been consistent in anything he drives. Yeah, and that's a good point, because he just drove the Proton number 88 Ford Mustang here, which is adding another car to his repertoire of GT cars he's driven. I think he tackled the entire GTE fleet at one point, if I'm not mistaken. With the exception of BMW, I believe. I don't believe he drove the M8. I don't think. But yeah, also adding that new GT3 car. To answer your question, yes, he is still a bronze, strictly because of his age.
Yep.
I believe when you turn 50, you are automatically demoted down a driver ranking. So he would have gone from silver to bronze, which is where he is now. But yeah, I mean, you've talked about Ben Keating and how strong he's been in GT cars or in the LMP2 cars to those Pro-Am lineups in the past, and I think he's going to continue to do so for a little while here.
Yep. Good old Ben Keating.
Big Ben. All right. We've talked about COTA for a long time here, and at trying to not make this episode quite as long as we had last week, I do want to move things on to the news portion of the show. Really only one major story I want to cover here, and it is IMSA related, and it did come out this morning, and that should probably give you a decent hint as to what we're going to be discussing here.
Thank goodness for Thursday shows.
It's the official confirmation that Wayne Taylor Racing will be partnering up with Cadillac next year for that factory effort, taking over from Chip Ganassi Racing and IMSA this year. We'll be bumping that up to a 2-car program versus the one that we're seeing from Ganassi in the WC and in IMSA this year, bringing the total up to 3 Cadillacs on the full-time IMSA grid for next season. It's a story that's been rumored for a very, very long time at this point. In fact, I asked a couple of weeks ago if this story had been confirmed yet, because I just didn't even know. It felt like it's been confirmed for a long time. But nice to finally get that officially on the board, that the 10 and the 40 will be back next year with some new Cadillac machinery and a return to Cadillac at that.
Yeah, there's a few announcements within this announcement to unpack. Of course, the headliner from all of this is Wayne Taylor Racing returning to Cadillac machinery. They spent the large majority of their existence racing with GM in one form or another, and whether it be the Corvette Daytona prototype or transitioning to be with Cadillac in the DPI era. So really good to see that Wayne Taylor Racing returning to Cadillac. Of course, a lot of this I think probably stems from their relationship with Andretti. Andretti, of course, working towards a Formula One bid with Cadillac. At the very least, I think that probably played a role in this. We haven't seen any confirmation of that. We probably never will. But also in that vein is that the team name, Wayne Taylor Racing with Andretti, is going to change yet again. They were Wayne Taylor Racing in the past, as we've come to know them as, and then due to their relationship with Andretti Autosport, changed to Wayne Taylor Racing with Andretti, and now they are going to be Cadillac Wayne Taylor Racing. So Cadillac being thrown in there with the name. They still have the partnership with Andretti. That's not changing, but just a slight name change there. Notable here, they're going to be running 2 cars still in the WeatherTech Championship. And yes, your math is not deceiving you. That does now mean that we're going to have 3 Cadillac V-Series Rs on the IMSA grid for next season. As also with this announcement, the Action Express Racing number 31 was confirmed to be staying on the grid in IMSA next year. So this is really a net positive all around. Exciting to see Wayne Taylor Racing back with a brand that I think many of us have come to associate them with in Cadillac. In recent years, they've had success with Acura, but they've won a championship with Cadillac in the DPI era. They've picked up, man, I can't remember how many Rolex 24 wins. Was it 3 Rolex 24s that they picked up with Cadillac along the way? It's at least multiple. They had a very good stretch with them. This is a great win for Cadillac, for Wayne Taylor Racing, a good partnership, I think. And I mean, we can't complain about seeing an extra Cadillac V Series R on the IMSA grid.
No, definitely not. And I was trying to remember myself. I know they won 17 and 19 at Daytona. They also won 22, was it? 21? No. 22. They won, I think. No, I can't remember.
No, Meyer Shank won the last DPI one.
Which
and
was
then
22.
they won.
So 21 WTR would have won with Acura, which was their debut with Acura.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So who won 2020?
Oof. 2020, a lot of that's faded from my memory now.
Either way, I mean, you mentioned how successful they were with Cadillac. I've talked about this in a previous episode. I think this is the most logical move for them. They're a team that, you mentioned how strong they were with Acura. They've seen a lot of success with Acura. I would actually like to argue on the contrary. I think with Acura, they really haven't been able to prove the true potential of their team. They honestly played second fiddle, I think, to Meyer Shank Racing when the two were competing against each other for Acura. And despite the fact that they were able to pick up a Rolex 24 win back in 2021, I just think that they weren't able to pull a championship for Acura. This year as well hasn't been going spectacular for them. And I think that going back to Cadillac, having that factory backing behind them, we talked about Ganassi struggling with Cadillac over in the World Endurance Championship. I think you could make a similar argument for IMSA. And I just think, again, this is another one just like COTA where it's a perfect pairing all around.
Yeah. And this is something that I think everybody has come to expect as well. Really, you could start to see the writing kind of play out on the wall when Chip Ganassi Racing was announced that they were going to be not running, when it was announced that they wouldn't be running a Cadillac next year. And then ultimately, about a month and a half, 2 months ago, we heard that Meyer Shank Racing would be coming back to run the Acura program. It was kind of a foregone conclusion where Wayne Taylor Racing was going to be ending up. But still a lot of unanswered questions as well with this announcement. What are the driver lineups going to look like? We don't really know what the contract status is of a lot of these drivers. It's not something that we get to hear about a lot in the sports car racing world. Are the Taylor brothers contracted to Acura? Are they contracted to Wayne Taylor Racing? This is all stuff that's going to play out here in the coming months when driver lineups are confirmed. But regardless, it's good to have this announcement formalized. And then also, again, I touched on the 31. And it is good to see this, confirms that we are going to have 3 Cadillacs on the grid. The 31 is going to be one of those cars. And I didn't want to talk about this without mentioning a really great article that was put out on Daily Sports Car by Stephen Kilby today that talks a lot about the 31 and Action Express Racing's journey through IMSA, and it really does highlight the success that they have had competing as a bit of a smaller program in IMSA, and really good to see them continuing on in this capacity with Cadillac, and they are still in a championship hunt. We're not going to dive into the IMSA championship hunt on this episode. We've done that plenty, or we did that plenty, or we've done that plenty in previous episodes. But good to see that the 31 has also been confirmed in this announcement. But still plenty of news to come out of this in terms of driver announcements, etc. in the coming months.
Yeah, we're still driver announcements from the 31 team as well for next year.
That's true.
And I did look it up because I was just killing myself to know the Wayne Taylor Racing did win back in 2020 at the Rolex 24 as well.
Okay, there we go.
Yes, 3 wins with Cadillac compared to their 1 with Acura.
Yep. All right, I think that covers it on the Wayne Taylor Racing. This is a big piece of news, but I feel like we've talked about it so much. There was a long build up to this announcement that everybody saw coming. So good to have it finally formalized, though.
Yep, confirmed. Talked about it plenty before, as you said. So
yep.
Nice to see the like you mentioned, that extra Cadillac on the grid for next year, though. And it doesn't come at the expense of any Acuras, because we'll be seeing that 2-car Meyer-Shank program on the grid next year as well. Alongside the 1 Heart of Racing Aston. I'm trying to think of what the grid numbers are going to look like for the GTP class next year. I'm sure you have a video in the works for that if you haven't put one out already.
Yeah, I haven't put one out yet, but it is definitely something that with this announcement has been brewing in my head. IMSA, we talked about the WEC being at capacity and having to turn entries away. IMSA definitely is at a very similar level. They're a little bit limited by track capacity at certain tracks, but it's going to be interesting as we see more teams formally announced to be confirmed already for the 2025 grid. It is early September. We were seeing these teams confirmed in August to be on the IMSA grid next year, and we're not going to talk about them on this show, but I think we will be talking about these as we progress closer to the end of the year. All of the confirmations that we've seen out of IMSA for teams next year, and where's the grid space going to come from for these additional GTP entries? That kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah. So we have a couple more questions in the chat. I'm going to leave those until the end of the episode, just as a chance to get any last questions in. I do want to touch on a question that we got pre-show over on Twitter/X, whatever we're calling it. Johnny Hardware. How about you guys speculate the GTD Pro grid for 2025? Hypercar and GTP has had people do that for a couple months now. I think it's time to look at doing this for GTD Pro at least for next year. Yes, begs a great question. Already mentioned Heart of Racing. Curious to see where they end up with their GT racing programs next year. It sounds like we're going to be seeing them in some capacity, but there's a lot of unanswered questions for the GTD Pro class next year.
Yeah, there are, and just want to preface this by saying, Johnny Hardware, we do really appreciate the question coming in early. If you want to get your question in ahead of time, then we always put out a call for questions before each one of these episodes. So keep an eye out for that on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, and we'll make sure to answer your question in the future. Yes. Do you say MySpace?
I did.
Oh no! Don't put it on MySpace. We won't see it there. But this really got the thoughts turning, and I think the best way to approach this is, of course, first by looking at the teams that we have on the grid this year. We've seen a very large increase. The grid size in the GTD Pro class in terms of full season entries essentially doubled from where we were last year to this year. This year we do have, I'm going to go down the point standings. And there are 9 full-time entries. We have AO Racing in a Porsche, Heart of Racing in an Aston Martin, Paul Miller Racing in a BMW, Vassar Sullivan in a Lexus. We have a couple of Corvettes. We have Pfaff in a McLaren, and then we have a couple of Fords. I think the natural... I don't have any reason to believe that any of these entries will be taking a step back from where they are this year. These all seem like fairly solid programs. Some of them have recently made the jump up to the GTD Pro class. Some of them are, I think, most of them, if not all of them, have a real proper factory backing that is behind them, or good factory support. So I don't think that we're going to see any of these entries take a step back in the future. The question that we have is, who could we see step up to this class next season? And we could look at, the GTD class right now and teams that are doing well. We saw Paul Miller Racing make the step up from GTD to GTD Pro. We've seen Pfaff step up from GTD to GTD Pro. I think the natural one to look at right now is Windward Racing. Do we see Windward Racing, who is, I don't know if there's really another way to put this, but they've kind of dominated the season in GTD. And we've seen Pfaff have a strong run, make the step up. Paul Miller Racing dominated last year. They made the step up. Do you think we see Windward Racing and Mercedes step up to the GTD Pro class and give us another full-time manufacturer there next year?
Well, it begs a good question. I think one we touched on a little bit last week, which is that Mercedes really isn't represented full-time in the GTD Pro class right now. I think I'd go out and say they're probably the most major manufacturer that is not represented there right now. If you look at the Mercedes GT stable of drivers, they certainly have no shortage of factory drivers they could evaluate throwing into that car for next year. And Windward certainly has proven that they're a capable team this year. Mm-hmm. You already mentioned Heart of Racing when they took a step up, Pfaff when they took a step up.
That's another one, yeah.
Paul Miller Racing when they took the step up. It's the other one, AO Racing, when they took the step up. We're seeing a lot of these teams that were successful in GTD. They're able to find the results in GTD Pro. Of course, it's a lot more competitive for them. But, perhaps that's exactly what the team wants. And, maybe with a little bit more eyes on the GTD Pro class, vying for the overall wins. I guess in theory, GTD Pro and GTD are evenly balanced, so a GTD car could win the GT ranks altogether, as has happened a couple of times. But generally speaking, I think more people are probably looking at the GTD Pro class than GTD, at least by a little bit. Maybe there is that incentive to jump up, especially if you're Windward Racing and you're able to dip into that Mercedes factory driver pool.
Yeah, Windward Racing, there's actually a couple other ones as well that I think could fall into this. And at least one of these we've seen, dipping their toes into some of these GTD Pro races. Conquest Racing. We have a comment here in the chat. Full season Ferrari in the Pro class, please. Could you see? We know that Risi Competizione has been historically an endurance cup program. We've seen them do that a lot in recent seasons, but could they step up to a full season program? Maybe if Ferrari kicked them a little bit of support, then that could certainly come together. They're a team that has won a race this year. Another Ferrari team that has won a race in the GTD Pro class this year, Conquest Racing. They've done a couple of these GTD Pro efforts. Could we see them potentially make the step up to this class? Again, it's probably largely dependent on what sort of support they would see from Ferrari and from a manufacturer. But that's one of those cars that we don't see represented in a full season capacity on the GTD Pro class, and I think that's who you have to look to for further expansion in the GTD Pro class is what manufacturer doesn't have a full season entry that could in the future. And the last one that I would really turn to is Lamborghini, another manufacturer that they have full season representation on the GTD front, but they don't have anything in the GTD Pro class. Of course, Iron Lynx has been present for the Endurance Cup races, but it hasn't been a very extensive program. You know, we have one Iron Lynx, the number 19, that has done the 3 Endurance Cup races so far. We occasionally see an additional Lamborghini on the grid in the GTD Pro class, but could we see Lamborghini step up in a full season capacity here? You know, there are other Lamborghini teams that run full season. Wayne Taylor Racing. My understanding is that even despite their change from Acura to Cadillac, this doesn't affect the GTD program at all. They still have a relationship with Lamborghini. Could we potentially see them bring a GTD Pro car to the grid and have Lamborghini represented in a full season capacity in the GTD Pro class? Heck, we've seen crazier things happen. So this is a long way of saying that for me, I think we're looking towards these manufacturers that don't currently have representation in a full season capacity on the GTD Pro grid, and looking at them for that further expansion in whether it be next year or a couple of seasons down the line. I don't know if you have any other thoughts to that, or any other cars that you kind of have circled in the GTD class maybe that could make a step up.
Well, I think you pretty much covered all of them that I was thinking of, at least. What I would ask is, all of that put together, where do you think, if you had to put a number on the board right now, of the number of entries we see in GTD Pro next year? You think we're up to a nice even 10, potentially 11, maybe 12 cars? Do you think that's a little ambitious?
I think it's hard to say. The way that all these sports car racing announcements tend to work is they may overpromise and then underdeliver. We definitely see teams committing to full season programs, and then those they can fall through. I think I'm pretty confident to say we're not going to see the grid almost double, like we saw the change made from last year, but I think we could reasonably see 11 entries in the full season championship for GTD Pro next year. Like I said, I don't think we're going to see any of these programs fall off from where we are this year. I think there's only room to expand. So I think, the nice number in my mind is 11. I think we could see 11 cars in the GTD Pro class full time. Again, we've seen larger GTD Pro grids this year for the Endurance Cup races, but 11 for the full season championship, I think, is reasonable.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Risi. They're a team I would love to see on the full time grid. They used to be for a long time they were a full time staple in the GTD ranks, whether it was the American Le Mans Series or earlier seasons of the WeatherTech SportsCar Championship as we know it today. I just see that as a team that hasn't really had the push to go to a full season program in recent seasons. And it's interesting because they've kept their ambition sky high. They've said they're evaluating a 499P program a couple of years back. So I'm kind of curious what the hurdle is for them, whether it's just not having that consistent driver lineup that would be able to accommodate a full season program, whether Ferrari's not giving them enough backing behind them, or really what it may be. But I would love to see them back in a full-time capacity, although I don't really see that happening next year, to be honest with you. My other real question is Mercedes in the World Endurance Championship. Do we see them get that call up to the LMGT3 class next year? And if so, what implications does that potentially have on the Mercedes entries that we see in IMSA?
Yeah.
Do we see a one-car windward entry over in the WEC representing Mercedes instead of IMSA? I think that's one of the questions that still has yet to be answered. So we'll see going into the offseason. I would expect that we're going to see at least one to make it a nice even 10, potentially maybe 2 cars up into the GTD Pro ranks for next year. But I wouldn't anticipate a whole lot more than that, at least right now.
Yeah, that's spot on. I'm confident it's not going to go down. Again, I'm also confident that we're going to get at least one more, and I think it would be reasonable to see 2, but more than that, I think would take a very large announcement from a manufacturer that if we were to see that.
Yeah. Someone in the chat saying the problem with Risi is they use 498P drivers most of the time. Yeah, for Daytona they do use Calato and Pierre Guidi. They're also using Davide Rigon and Daniel Serra this year. You only need 2 drivers for a full-time program in IMSA. You can rely on really whoever you can find for the endurance races, and you could even run 2 drivers at the 6-hour enduros as we usually see.
Yeah.
So it's really, you're just talking Daytona, Sebring, Petit Le Mans. I don't see any reason with the Ferrari driver academy as large as it is, that they wouldn't be able to pull a couple of GT drivers into that program. It's just sort of the main question is really, does it intersect with the European racing commitments that they may be having on the GT front? Potentially that's the real issue here.
Yep.
Okay, I think that covers that, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if
I think it does. I think that covers that nicely.
Couple other questions before we wrap things up here. Do you think the improved Alpine performances of late are a sign they're starting to find their feet in hypercar and can be a regular contender at the front of the field moving forward? It's interesting. They brought upgrades to COTA this year. They have a car that is, in theory, more reliable than we saw at Le Mans. It is, of course, the first year for that program. I think really right now we see 3 manufacturers that are really at the top in the WEC, and it's Toyota, Ferrari, and Porsche. Those are the 3 who I can really confidently say I would put in contention for the win at most races. There hasn't been a whole lot of exception to that. I know I just picked Cadillac for COTA, to be honest with you.
Yep.
In the back of my mind, that was a little bit of an ambitious pick. We'll just call it fun. I do think manufacturers like Cadillac and Alpine and BMW right now are sort of on that second rung where they're really more fighting for the top 5s right now. And then, below that, you have Peugeot, who's really struggling this year. Way more than I think a lot of people expected, including themselves. And I know there's another follow-up question related to them that I'll get to in a second. Just for Alpine, though, I think with more time, they're a team that has won in the hypercar category, albeit with a grandfathered LMP1 car. They've won in the LMP2 class countless times. So Signatech has the experience. And I think the drivers are certainly capable, and the car itself has proved surprising to me on a couple of occasions this year. It's just a question of really breaking in to that top 3 consistently, especially if you want to start talking about a championship run, which I don't know if I see that being the case in the next year or so, but we'll see. I think next year they should be in a position where they're at least fighting up at the front. Whether they're fighting up at the front at the end is another question, but what we've seen from them this year, I think, is at least a decent start. And if you exclude the 24 hours of Le Mans, which I think was a real burn for them this year, they've had a pretty solid introductory rookie season with that car, I think.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of differences between the two, but I feel like we were kind of thinking the same thing about Porsche at this point last season. You
Yeah.
know, they struggled certainly at times, but they also had the glimmers of what the potential was with that car. And you know, the amount of data that, you know, Penske has at their disposal between their entries in IMSA and the WEC, yeah, they had a lot that they've been able to build off of in the off season towards this year. But you know, it is important to remember, and I know you mentioned it, that this is Alpine's. You know, it's their rookie season. They're learning this car. They're learning how this car reacts to these tracks. And this is a very capable team. You mentioned that they won with the grandfathered LMP1. So I wouldn't be counting on Alpine having a rise in the same way that Porsche has had this season in with Alpine next year in 2025. But I would not at all be surprised to see Alpine as a regular contender for podiums next year with this car, especially if they maintain the trajectory that they've been on. You know, they have been impressive with that car, and they do appear to be towards the front end of that sort of midfield fight, you know, with Cadillac, with BMW, the teams that are kind of that small step behind the front three. So I certainly could see Alpine step up next year. I think they've been very strong this year, and you know, there's still a couple of races left to go in this season. We could very well be continuing this conversation as the season winds down, and talking about Alpine putting themselves in a really good position heading into next year. So you know, there's always a lot of storylines to watch in sports car racing, but I think Alpine is definitely one that's worth keeping a very close eye on.
Yeah, that car seems especially quick at the high speed circuits, which has been a little bit of a surprise to me. But we saw that they were decently strong on pace at Le Mans. They were decently strong here at COTA with long straights as well. And there's 2 races left this year. The real breakout race for Porsche last year was the 6 Hours of Fuji. That's what we have up next this year. Perhaps we see a similar story, whether it's from Alpine or maybe another manufacturer.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's plenty of time for them, I think, to continue to get acclimated with that car.
Yep.
And then on the flip side, if we're going to talk about the 9X8, what do you make of Peugeot? They seem to have gone backwards in 2024. Is that purely due to the added competition in the top class, or do they need a shake-up internally to get back on track? Yeah, it's not really gone to plan. I would say that much. Their most promising race this year was the season opener at Qatar, where they were running that 2020.
Yeah.
Well, the same car as last year. We'll call it the 22 spec car. And I think that leaving that race was very optimistic, because yes, they might have had that heartbreak at the very end of the race that cost them the podium. But when you're leaving that race and you're looking to the future, okay, they have a new reworked car coming out. It's got upgrades on it. It should be a lot more consistent from track to track. We were really talking about them as a team that could be fighting for top 5s this year. And they've been nowhere. I mean, absolutely nowhere this season, ever since they came out with that Evo spec car. So I don't really know what to pin the issue on. They had issues with that car previously last year. It seemed like they were starting to get to grips with it a little bit, but it was very track dependent. I mean, there were some races where they were nowhere. There were some races where they were surprising. This year, it just seems like they've sort of flatlined across the board. And what can you really pin that up to? I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine a whole lot has changed within that team besides the car itself. You could say maybe the balance of performance can be a little bit more generous to them if you look at the pure tables. But I haven't seen a whole lot out of them that indicates that they're anywhere really near the front right now. So hoping to see them make some progress in the off season. Maybe take advantage of a couple more Joker upgrades on that car. I'm not too sure how many they have left with that car after the upgrades they made for this year, but clearly in a hole right now that they need to try to dig themselves out of.
Yeah, I think, we kind of talked about it when we were talking about Alpine is, it's Alpine's rookie season. I think maybe it is important to remember that, this Peugeot, this car has changed drastically from what that car was at the start of the season. And I think, I don't know, it is disappointing to see that they haven't, picked up in sort of the footsteps that they were starting to build with that previous spec car. But I don't know if there's anything. I'm still optimistic for them looking forward to next season. I think that they can continue to build off of this car. They're still learning, a lot about the car and how how it performs. I think if we looked at them at this point last year, I think you could probably argue that they were in a pretty similar position, kind of underwhelming. But then they came out swinging in the first race of the 2024 season. I don't see a reason why they couldn't come out swinging to start next season as well. Now, I mean, could this first race of this year have been sort of a one-off performance? Maybe. But I don't think they made the upgrades to the car for a reason. I think they just need to wrap their heads around it. This was, treat this as a learning opportunity and a learning season, and hopefully they come out strong next year. I guess to really answer the question, what do you make of their performance this year? Yeah, it's been disappointing. You would expect them to be out and really in that, at least in that sort of midfield battle with BMW, with Cadillac, with Alpine, and they haven't been. They've been disappointing. So they've been disappointing, but still optimistic about what they can do in the future. As I don't know, maybe I'm just optimistic about a lot of.
There's a lot of optimism
cars
going on here.
Yeah.
We've said a whole lot of hopefully this and hopefully that, and
maybe too optimistic. No.
Yeah, I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I mean, I'm looking at the point standings for this year, and the number 94 car is the only full season hypercar. So basically, just excluding Asada Fraschini, that has no points. Not a single point, not a single top 10 this year for that team.
Lamborghini has 1 point, right?
Lamborghini has 2 points.
Oh, okay.
From the 24 Hours of Le Mans.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, it's got to go up in 25, I guess. Is the only thing you can say about that. The sister car, the 93, at least with two of the drivers in that car, Mikkel Jensen and Nico Muller, do have 7 points, but we're still talking way off what we're seeing from the championship leaders in the number 6 Porsche at 125. So
yeah,
I don't know what the secret is that they're really missing, but we're going to have to see some pretty hefty changes from that team over the offseason, whether it's just team personnel. I don't know if it's so much a driver issue. I don't know. I can't really pin one thing to put it up to right now, apart from maybe just saying the car is not, that Evolution spec car is not going the way that they had expected.
Or they just don't have a good handle on it too, like this is something they introduced after the season started. And I know that they had kind of planned to do that, but still, you're in the lead up to the season, you're splitting your resources between preparing this new car and also getting, this now previous spec car ready to be competitive. And they certainly came out of the gate swinging, but I don't know. I'm still gonna err on the side of, give them a little bit more time, and they do seriously need to show something with this car early next year, though, because if we're still having these discussions, of them being not even a mid-pack team by Le Mans of next year, then that's going to be concerning.
Yeah. And last thing, I guess since you got it in before the end of the episode, they need to ditch the wannabe F1 top 10 points payout. Too short of a season for all of that. I could see some teams leaving. It's definitely higher stakes. I'll give it that.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about how, if you're championship leader by 25 points, you finish outside of the points in the next race, which nowadays is really not that difficult to do.
Yeah.
If we're talking about 2022, then sure, it's pretty easy to finish inside the top 10 in the hypercar class. It's guaranteed.
Mm-hmm.
But nowadays, when you have an 18 car class, we're going to have more next year. Even just a meh race is going to lead you outside the top 10, or it could at least. So, yep. And what we're seeing this year, as I've mentioned previous episodes, is consistency is winning championships, especially in the WEC right now. With the 6 car picking up their worst finish of the season at COTA. In sixth, it's really paying off for them right now, and that's why they're still holding the championship lead despite only having one win at the season opener at Qatar. Do I think they need to change the point system? Not necessarily, to be honest with you. I don't think the points system is going to cause teams to leave. I think lack of performance over the duration of multiple seasons is going to put the program in the eyes of the we'll call them the suits, the executives behind those programs, or the stakeholders behind those automobile companies. And that's where you're going to start to see manufacturers threaten to leave. I don't know if the points payout specifically would be to blame for that, though. I think that's more in terms of just raw performance of the cars. And there's really two things the manufacturers care about. The first thing they really care about is the 24 Hours of Le Mans win. I think that's far more important to any of these teams in the championship. And then the second thing is that championship. But if you're really fighting outside the top 3/5 of the championship anyways, how much of a difference is it really to be 12th versus 17th in the points to some of these teams? I don't know. I mean, the World Endurance Championship doesn't have as many eyes on it as Formula One, where that's really going to be a huge difference. So,
yeah,
my take.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that I'll highlight in this as well is, I mentioned it earlier, how we have both ends of sort of, we have two completely different sides between IMSA and the WEC. IMSA is handing out those points from first all the way down to the last car that starts the race. And in the WEC, in the hypercar class, it's only the top 10 that are getting those points. So, again, different contrasting championships. I really do appreciate that they are distinctly different in so many of these different ways. It is refreshing for us diehard fans to you have different things that you're looking out for in each of these races. So I may not be the biggest fan of the top 10, only getting points, but I can certainly appreciate it. And I do, at the end of the day, I'm fine with the WEC having the top 10 point structure, because that does lead to different discussions over the course of the race. Getting into just the top 10 is a big deal, whereas that battle from that pressure that the 11th and the 12th place cars are putting on, it's kind of all or nothing at that point. Whereas in a championship like IMSA, they're still bringing home solid points, so it might not create that same sort of a battle that we might see in the WEC. So I don't know, just we can appreciate the differences of all of these championships. I think everyone would agree.
Well, I want to continue to give you the floor, see if you have any closing thoughts. I do want to wrap this episode up because we're just shy of 2 hours, and I'm sure we can keep this episode under that barrier.
All right. It's WEC round was great. We have Fuji coming up for the WEC, and we have Indy coming up for IMSA. So we're in the home stretch of both of these seasons. We have, it's going to be a lot of fun this next sort of month or so, talking about these seasons wrapping up.
Yeah, you just mentioned Fuji in a little over a week's time at this point. We're going to be off next week. We'll have an episode a couple of weeks from now, TBD on the actual day that we do that episode, whether it's Tuesday or Thursday. I'll keep you posted on Twitter/X at Rain Race Podcast. You can check us out there. We're over 2 hours at this point. It's over. Hopefully the next episodes will be a little bit shorter. Somehow we managed to turn one race recap and really only one news story into, I think, our longest episode between the two of us on the 1 year mark since reviving this show. But as I mentioned at the start of the episode, hopefully too many more. We got plenty more to discuss, even coming into another off season for both championships. So want to, as always, thank you to anybody who tuned in this episode live or on a podcasting platform. We'll be back in a couple of weeks' time. Hope to see you all there, and take care.